Recording begins. It is October 20th now. This is ESM 105. Thank you all for making it. Oh, please, everybody, quiet down. There's so many of you. You see, the camera faces me, so it's like a little joke for the people watching the recording. Anyway, let's go ahead and look where we are in the semester. We're past halfway. By any way that you're measuring it, we're in week 9. We're past halfway through. All right. And here we are on the schedule. So right now I'm looking at the syllabus for people on the recording. We're there in week 9, catching up on previous materials. So this week we will wrap up our biodiversity PowerPoint. And then next week, ecological economics, human populations, pesticides, poisons, pollution, all this stuff, right? But next week you'll have quiz 4 due on November 2nd. So it's like the Monday or the Sunday, I believe, of that week. And that's going to cover the biodiversity PowerPoint. So don't forget about that upcoming quiz. It'll have a question in the same format you've been used to, but this one will be about stuff, because last time we did cradle to cradle, and that's the end of your assigned readings for the semester. So the remainder of the class, just keep working on your RES project. Wait, no, you don't do RES here. You do annotated bibliography here. Keep working on your annotated bibliography. Don't forget about those weekly discussions. I know they're only 3 points each, but you know, it could be the difference between an A- and a B+, and you want the A-, right? Otherwise, are there any questions? Looking at the schedule here in front of us? All right, sick. Let's go ahead and pop open this PowerPoint again. Okay, so in our biodiversity PowerPoint, as I mentioned before, we're basically looking at species conservation and habitat conservation after establishing at the beginning the reasons for conserving biodiversity. Okay, we talked a little bit about like gene banks last time, because at the end of the day, maintaining biodiversity is a way of maintaining genetic diversity. That's a way to look at different species even, is species are very different from one another, so different genetically that they can't breed, and that means that conserving multiple species conserves a bunch of different genetics. It's just a different way of looking at it. So we are now on to habitat conservation in this PowerPoint, and we're talking a little bit about deforestation. Okay, we talked about boreal forests and how they can be underappreciated as an endangered habitat type. All right, because usually when we think about endangered forests, we think about tropical rainforests. This is the thing that comes to mind, because that's what we've been told over and over again is the most endangered type of forest. And while they are endangered and are very actively harvested, the boreal forests haven't been quite so disturbed because of difficulties in extracting the forest resources. So this is an opportunity where we can use the knowledge that we've gleaned from previous forest harvesting and try to harvest the boreal forests in a more sustainable way. All right. Boreal forests are also at risk due to climate change. There's effects to the permafrost, where the permafrost used to limit soil decomposition, allowing boreal forests to be an important carbon sink for the global carbon cycle. But you know, the permafrost doesn't last as long as it used to. It's not as perma. Okay, cool. Good. Talked about this. We talked about this. Increased fire frequency, tropical and boreal forests, forest harvest methods, and why does deforestation happen? All right. Well, pulling out resources. Okay. Clearing land for agricultural use. So we got commercial logging, clearing land for agricultural use, big problems. And part of this is, part of the thing that I wanted you to think about previously was, what's the fate of the wood once it's harvested? And I know I hit carbon cycle a lot, but it is an important aspect of global cycling of the system that can be underappreciated. All right? So there's a difference between a tree burning, and then it emits most of its carbon back into the atmosphere, and a tree being used to build a house. That's an interesting way to think about carbon sequestration, as a house being a sequestration place for carbon. But Why not think about it that way? You can change the way you think about it later. All righty, biofuel. Biofuels, back when I was a student, that was what was going to change everything and make everything more sustainable. As we were going to adjust, we were going to produce a ton of biofuels. We were going to do genetic engineering of bacteria to make them make all of these oils. There was some really cool work that started to happen, but these take a lot of infrastructure. And usually you end up falling back on established methods. So if you can just farm something and then extract the oils from it, or convert or ferment it and convert it into ethanol, well then that's an established method. It has an established infrastructure. There's already companies that can do that at large scales. So that tends to be what ends up happening. So biofuel production has caused a lot of deforestation. We talked a little bit about regulations that required that ethanol be added into gasoline, and then the questions of if that actually increases sustainability in any way. It's a really interesting rabbit hole to dive down. But one major source, historically, not, when I say historically, I don't mean for hundreds of years, but in the more recent history, okay, and as of a few years ago, and even currently, palm oil is a huge source of biofuel stock. Okay. Awesome question.
I did a little bit of research after what we talked about on Friday.
Great, that's awesome.
Up until pretty much now, California was only putting 10% ethanol in gas.
Yeah.
And now we're doing 15 after the last couple months. Is that what you were talking about on Friday?
That's exactly what I was referencing. Okay. Yeah. I don't think I specifically mentioned the increase in the amount that's being added into fuels, okay. But I was more trying, that information just brings to light this is still being done. Mm-hmm. And there's data to support doing it, but it's all about a full picture. If you have a full picture of what the actual impact is on the vehicle, what the impact is on actual emissions from operating the vehicle, that's very different than a controlled setting where you just burn this fuel, and find this fuel's cleaner. So it's got the ethanol in it. Let's just burn the fuel with the ethanol in it. It burns cleaner, and it releases the same amount of energy. But can it be harvested as effectively by the engine? The answer is no, because vehicles aren't designed to do that. It's like you can't just retrofit new technology into the vehicles that people are actually driving around. It's interesting stuff. So yeah, we've got ethanol as a biofuel. We've got biodiesels as a biofuel, which work better, It takes less retrofitting to make a vehicle run off of biodiesel usually. And a lot of large-scale commercial transport relies on diesel fuel. So biodiesel is an avenue to investigate. It's not like, once again, where are all these emissions coming from? They're coming from transportation and all these companies, and there's no way to force them to incur all of this cost of, now you're going to make all of your vehicles run off of electric. And then how do you build the grid for supplying these things? You've run into these problems before, I'm sure, in your consideration of natural resource conservation. So palm oil's a rough one. Palm oil grown for biofuels, palm oil's grown for biodiesels. Okay, well, oil palm is the plant. Palm oil, here's a big old, this is in Indonesia. Here's a massive clear cut, all right, being used just to grow oil palm because it's an economic product now. And the market has been created by sort of promoting it as a sustainable option, as a more sustainable option. It's the reason why we need to consider entire systems. Inputs, outputs, throughputs, and that'll come up again when we talk about ecological economics, which is really designed to incorporate the services of the ecosystem as part of economics. Okay, cool. Forests. What else is a threat to forests besides human activity? Well, climate change, all right? increased temperature, increased fire frequency, drought, all these things affect forest stability. You always have to have this in any ecology course or ecology adjacent course where you talk about historical patterns of fire suppression and then the effect of that fire suppression, of those fire suppression efforts. At the end of the day, it really comes down to fires are a natural disturbance in forest ecosystems, all right? And preventing those fires causes the ecosystems to actually function worse, all right? We call it fuel loading, where you get a bunch of fuel falling onto the ground, and it usually would burn away regularly with a low intensity fire. And the phrase, or the term intensity, is a specific metric for fires. This is another opportunity for us to take something used in the common vernacular and sort of like clean it off a little bit and then hold it up and see what it actually means when a researcher says it, all right? Or when somebody who specializes in fire talks to you about intensity, okay? Because you know intuitively, oh, that fire's more intense, that fire's less intense. It's all about the amount of energy being released per unit space. Usually it's represented as per unit fire line, because a fire spreads in a straight line. And so instead of doing it by area, you do it by the distance of the line. But that's not the important thing here. It's really important that it's about the amount of energy being released. Because these ecosystems have adapted to regular, low-intensity fires, but fire suppression leads to irregular, high-intensity fires. High-intensity fires can bypass plants' defenses. They can kill seeds in the seed bank. They can destroy the soil microbiome. They can spread into the canopy and move through the forest in different ways. Fire ecology is its own field. Please.
Can you explain the difference between intensity and severity?
Absolutely. So I thank you so much for asking a question that I am prepared to answer. Intensity versus severity. So yeah, these are two terms that are used in fire ecology. Also, if you're interested in fire ecology, there's a degree that's kind of underutilized here. It requires a wild number of units to complete, but it's a very practical degree in fire ecology at Cal Poly Humboldt. It's more units than any other major, I think, on campus that you have to do to complete it. But essentially, everybody who finishes that crazy, usually 5-year program goes out and works in fire ecology with the bachelor's. You're good to go. If you want to talk more about that, just come chat with me. You know, it's an option out there. So intensity. Intensity is a measure of energy released by the fire. Okay, severity is a measure of, let's say, I'm gonna be careful with my language. I'm gonna say how the plant community is affected. Okay, so a high severity fire kills a large proportion of the plant community. A high intensity fire releases a lot of energy. A high intensity fire can be more severe and probably is, but they are two different aspects of the fire itself. Cool?
Yeah.
Awesome.
I just needed a quick recap, right?
Why not? Yeah, no.
They mix together very.
Yeah, they do. They do. And the words like in your day-to-day life, you might use these words interchangeably when you're not talking about fire. Cool. Great. Fire management has changed over time, and now prescribed burns are conducted. There's not as much fire suppression in the forest. It's more about mitigation of the impacts on human communities that live near or in those forests, rather than just stop the fire. There's an image that I found in a textbook when I first started here, and I can't find it anymore, and it's been driving me nuts. But it's an old black and white picture from Germany of foresters, and they're doing forest management, and they're literally raking the understory and like tidying the understory. So I loved that image as an example of like, here's old ideas of forest management. Now we understand that the natural system tends to take care of itself, and we want to try to maintain that more. Anyway. Good. Many fires are now larger and more severe, also more intense. Risk of severe fires, specifically killing more of the plant community. Or technically destroying more plant biomass, which does not always translate into mortality, but anyway. Forest protection. What's being done? Well, some of the world's forests are actually now protected. Okay, so protected areas. That's great. Forest reserves, okay, being established in Brazil. Brazil's pretty good with their appreciation or with their acknowledgement of ecotourism as an industry. All right, so the way that Brazil justifies a lot of these preservation and conservation efforts is to say, if all the forests go, nobody will come here. We get a lot of money from people coming to Brazil. And that's, in a nutshell, what's going on right there. All right. So I wanted to talk to you, and this honestly should be in the ecological economics PowerPoint, but I think it fits better here. Ecological economics, we're basically just going to talk a lot about how do we actually include the value of nature in our ecologic models, in our economic models. Okay, it's going to be a lot of that with some discussion of organizations made up of companies that with their missions and how they manage this stuff. But anyway, this is pretty interesting stuff. Debt for nature swaps. Okay, these are commonly conducted. We're also going to talk about green and blue bonds. So you'll often see taglines from companies of, oh, we've invested this much money back into conservation efforts, or we've invested this much money back into nature, like we are a green company. So green and blue bonds, they're the same thing, but green is for terrestrial, blue is for marine. All right. Okay, cool. So first, debt for nature swaps. I'm excited to talk to you about this one. Here's what happens. Do I have a slide that shows it maybe a little better? No, this is fine. This is fine. So a company or an organization, like a conservation organization, buys up a bunch of debt that another country has to the United States. So debts exchanged between countries, right? We are aware of this on some level. All right? Now, I don't know if you've ever been under debt collection. I'm not saying I have, but I was a student for a long time. And sometimes you get a call from a company and they'll say to you, hey, you jerk, tell you what, we'll cut you a deal. We will settle your $5,000 debt for $1,500. All right? That'll happen. Honestly, this is like life hack stuff. If you ever have a collection company coming after you, ask them how much they'll take. Because the person on the phone, you don't actually owe them $5,000. You owed somebody else $5,000, and they purchased that debt for maybe $1,000. So if they get $1,500 or $2,000 out of you, they're still making a profit. It's a debt exchange. This is the world economy that we live in now, is the trading of debt being a huge thing, which is frustrating and interesting. But anyways, Debt for nature swaps. Here's what happens. There's a country, the biggest one that's had a lot of these debt for nature swaps right here, currently is Ecuador, all right, because they did a major one in 2023. So Ecuador owes a bunch of money to the US. Let's say it's $100 million, all right? A company purchases that debt for $15 million, all right? And now they own that country's $100 million debt, but they paid $15 million for it. And then they offer to forgive that country's debt in exchange for them taking that $15 million or $100 million that was debt and investing it into conservation efforts. So it's a debt for nature swap, where then they say, well, yeah, we'll set this entire forest area aside as a nature preserve for the next 100 years. And we can justify that we would have received this much income. We would have made the 15 million from income from harvesting that forest, but instead we won't, and then you forgive our debt. All right? And that's a debt for nature swap in a nutshell right there. So it requires that the country whose debt is being forgiven invest into nature, a preservation or a conservation effort. And in exchange, they get a debt forgiven. And the country that they owed the money to gets the money. And the company that purchased the debt or gets publicity, positive publicity, or the conservation organization fulfills their mission. You know, they've carried it out. It's worked. Debt for nature swaps happen all the time. Been happening since the 1980s. Pretty wild stuff. Yeah.
So the company that buys the debt uses the money for the preserve?
The company that buys the debt, they then tell the country that's going to make the preserve to do the conservation effort. The company doesn't usually actually build the nature preserve. It's a weird circle. Yeah.
Where does the owed money? Where does the rest of the owed money go? So the company just gives a fraction of money to buy it.
It all just blows away like dust in the wind. All right? That's the thing with these debts, is when somebody owes a massive debt like this, when it's between countries, or even when it's on the scale of me or you. If that debt sits long enough, the debt doesn't have the value of 10 grand. The debt, based on your credit and things, has a value of, say, 2 grand. So the debt on the debt trading market has a lower value than the actual amount of money that you borrowed or took a loan out for or owed to a country based on past debts and interest rates that have built up. Because a lot of these debts are just, you default on your payments and then the interest rate goes up. That number just went up. There was never an exchange of money. But now this company says, or this country says, well, now you owe us 100 million. Or the company says to you, now you owe us 80,000 for those student loans that were 20,000. And sometimes, it doesn't work with student loans because that's a whole thing. But sometimes those companies will be like, well, we'll sell that debt to somebody else, make 20 grand out of it at least, and then they can deal with doing the collections. Is that kind of clarified a little bit? It's really weird. It's super weird stuff. And on top of that, you've also got these green and blue bonds, which are different from debt for nature swaps. Because a debt for nature swap, it usually involves forgiveness of those debts after the original debtor fulfills some requirements. Like, okay, you did the conservation effort, you set up the nature preserve, awesome, it's wiped clean. Cool. Then Apple puts it on their main page, like, we donated $120 million to conservation efforts this year. You can do it that way. Question?
Is that why companies like are so avidly like kettle chips?
Yeah, they're the one I always think of too, because like we put this much money into wind farms or something like this.
Is that the same sort of thing?
It's not exactly the same, but those are, those are also really, really interesting. Sometimes it can be as simple as the company has some money and they invest it into another company that does like non-profit wind farm construction. And that's pretty clean and straightforward. And of course, everybody's skimming a little off the top. It's a non-profit company. Everybody's getting paid still. And there's somebody organizing that company who's probably getting paid a decent amount. You know, it's just that's just that system. But sometimes if a company's putting forth that they offset carbon emissions, that should make your ears raise, because offsetting carbon emissions can be done in a ton of different ways, and sometimes it's really weird. Like Arcata, they recently made some money by guaranteeing that they wouldn't develop portions of the forest for the next 150 years. All right. And then there was some company that wanted to say, hey, we offset carbon outputs, and they judged it as, if we had clear cut that forest, it would have emitted this much carbon. We pay you to not clear cut that forest, and therefore we offset that much carbon from our own emissions. So they're kind of cheating, because that project was never probably going to happen. That forest was never going to be harvested or clear cut. So this is just a way that the city makes some decent money, and the company gets to emit a bunch of carbon someplace else. But that carbon emission that they did, which could possibly elicit fines or just get bad press, goes down on paper to here, because that forest would have emitted this much carbon had it been harvested. So it's it's complicated on purpose. You know, these things, when things get this complicated and there's money involved, it's usually complicated on purpose.
So you can't follow trails?
Yeah, and you can follow them if you dig down, if you dig down deep enough, all of this needs to have a paper trail. There is a paper trail there, and that's one thing that's good to point out. It's just an issue of finding the information. But it's posted. It's all available. You can look at Apple's claims of how much money they've invested, how many green investments they've made, and it's all itemized. And it's mostly green bonds, all right, which are additionally wild, because with a green bond, you've got a country that owes money to another country. So a similar setup for the debt for nature swap. But this is more of you're not being quite as altruistic, because you're going to make your money back still. All right. So you have the country, it owes another country money. You buy that debt, you get the same setup. Now you own a country's debt, and now you can say to them, hey, we're going to issue you a bond, a loan. We're going to give you a loan for the amount of money that you owed to that debt. So now here's more debt to us. But if you fulfill these, if you invest in these green projects or these blue projects and these conservation projects, right, that can either reduce the amount that you actually pay, or the money that you invest into the project could count as payments to us, or more likely, here's the bond, here's this thing. You went from owing $100 million to the United States government. Now you owe $15 million to Apple, and we're going to give you a loan for that $15 million. So there it is, $15 million. Now you owe us $30 million, all right? And you have to invest that loan into green projects. So now you owe less money than you owed before. You owed $100 million, now you owe $30 million, right? But you're signed up for having to complete these projects that are environmentally helpful. It's nuts. Question.
Can that 30 million then wait that out and get hacked down even further?
It's a great question. Probably. Yeah. I'm not so sure about how many times you can keep waiting and just keep doing that, But it's really just a wild whole market there. So a lot of the time when you see a company claiming we invested this much into some conservation project, it's because they loaned money to a company. They're getting that money back, but they're considering that as a green investment because the country otherwise would not have been able to carry out the conservation effort. Does that make sense? Does it make sense, kind of?
In the end, the loanee of the money still ends up paying like a decent amount of money.
Oh yeah, whoever took the debt out initially, they still end up paying money. Yeah, because but you end up owing less than you owed before, but you owed that money on paper. Were you ever really going to pay that full amount? Were you ever going to pay the 100 million, or were you going to keep paying the interest to the country that you owed the 100 million to? It's like having $200,000 in credit card debt. You're never going to pay that 200,000, but you're going to keep paying them. You just keep cruising along it. So it's really wild how it works on different scales, and they've kind of allowed us, it's great, to take advantage of the same system that countries were using long before private credit was really a thing. International credit is sort of the model for private credit. This should all have been in the ecological economics, huh? I'm just realizing. Yeah. Well, that's okay. So, yeah. Since the 80s, this has been a thing, these debt for nature swaps. There's a lot of debt. There are people and organizations that do care and are buying up this debt and forgiving it, and that's really cool. Yeah.
So in this graph, what exactly did Ecuador contribute to?
Absolutely. Where's my Ecuador? Where's my Ecuador slide? Where'd I put my Ecuador slide? Oh my God. This is so embarrassing. I swear that I had a slide ready for this. Oh yeah, I remember what happened. I was making these slides. It was all about, here we go. It was Galapagos Island stuff. All right, which is pretty cool, you know? How are you gonna actually conserve the Galapagos Islands? How are you gonna prevent a country that's got this massive amount of debt from harvesting that or starting to allow unsustainable tourism there? You see what I mean? Not regulating that. So yeah, it was what was it, $8 billion? Something like that? 85 million guarantee, 6.56 million political risk insurance to Ecuador. All right, there's all this language that you start running into. So yeah, that's the largest one ever. And of course, when you start to go down, like what did they actually do? It fell short of what people were originally hoping, but you did end up with more protection for the Galapagos Islands because of this debt for nature swap. Yeah. Cool. So there's our green and blue bonds and our debt for nature swap as a way of usually conserving habitats, because we're technically in our habitat conservation section. I figured it would fit in there pretty well. How'd that work? Because this is my first time structuring these PowerPoints. Did that fit reasonably enough? Okay, cool. That's why I want I always need to see get some feedback, see what the transitions felt like. Okay, grasslands. Anybody here doing agristology or going that route at all? It's wild that we actually have a program for that here because it's usually just it seems too boring to attract students. But if you talk to anybody in the grass class, they're usually pretty into it because it is fascinating. Huh? Like rangeland. Yeah, exactly. I forget. We're in ESM. Wildlife folks, ESM, it's rangeland. Yep. So yeah, if you're doing the rangeland focus, you understand the importance of grasslands. They seem less exciting than forests, but they're incredibly important. They cover 1/4 of the world's land surface, and they're already pretty open and easier to clear, so it's not too difficult to convert them into cropland, urban areas, or other uses that benefit humans more directly, right? Turn it into a dang old suburb. So they get disturbed way more rapidly. There's a high rate of disturbance. They have regular fires. All right, there's a ton of threatened species. There are a ton of threatened species here. A lot of it's degraded, all right, and that's usually due to overgrazing. And so management practices usually involve adjusting grazing of grasslands in an attempt to reduce degradation. All right. These are always interesting. Grazing fees charged for use of public lands. Okay. So you've got some cattle, you've got some sheep, you want to give them additional space to graze. You don't want them to graze, you don't have enough private land for them to graze without destroying it. So you pay a grazing fee and you get to use public grasslands for grazing. These fees are usually, fees like this, farm bills, this sort of thing, okay? It's usually taken a hit from the government's usually taken a hit on the actual money they could make from this fee. It's like if you were, It's really cheap. That's huge, right? Yeah, it's really cheap. And then we'll talk a little bit about farm subsidies and farm bills later, because these are also sort of costs that the public incurs effectively, okay? And it subsidizes industries which now don't have to pay the entire overhead cost of producing their product, which they're now selling, all right? So having low-cost grazing fees effectively makes raising these sorts of animals that degrade grasslands more profitable, because you don't have to pay as much as you normally would have. You don't have to buy the land, for example, right? So anyways, that's sort of how these things spiral. So new grazing methods. Okay, very good. Rotational grazing. That's the big new grazing method that I'm talking about here with you. Is you just enclose the areas and you move the animals and you move them around, you keep moving them, and that way you allow natural succession to sort of occur. Grasslands are highly adapted to disturbance because disturbances are common in grasslands. So effectively a grazing animal is just a disturbance that sweeps through. The problems arise when there's preferential feeding habits that can really throw things off. And then when fires are suppressed, the natural pattern of disturbances in grasslands is, with me drastically oversimplifying it, is sort of grazing pressure and fires. And those two things are both there maintaining the plant community at its healthy state. If you remove one or increase one and decrease the other pressure, that shifts the community composition. With the main example on this slide being cattle prefer to graze the nice, soft, new growth of the grasses or the species that just produce softer tissue. So therefore, having cattle overgrazing an area will cause different species that have tougher leaves to dominate. All right? So you do rotational grazing, you let succession go through normally. Sometimes you do prescribed burns in grasslands as well, and that can help to maintain the natural system. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I've heard about people using grazing in forests as well to like reduce fire.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it benefits the grazers, like the grazers, and it also benefits like from reducing the fires.
Yeah.
Is that it? Like, would that help with the grasslands as well?
If you can move the grazing pressure to forests, right, then it's not on the grasslands anymore, 100%. The only question is then does another individual come through and start to graze on the grasslands that you vacated because you're doing the more sustainable grazing practice, which probably has a lower economic yield, which isn't offset by some sort of subsidy like reduced grazing fees. You see what I mean? And we'll talk about, we'll do the classic tragedy of the commons talk when we hit our ecological economics, because that's what it starts to boil down to a lot of the time, is if you stop doing the unsustainable but profitable practice, there is most likely somebody else who will be happy to do the unsustainable profitable practice, and then there's been no net benefit. And that's a great way to justify taking, not making any changes and taking no action. Right? Somebody else is going to do the bad thing, so why shouldn't I do the bad thing? But that's just, yeah, it's just, it's a little bit of a bummer. Did I answer your question okay?
Yeah.
Solid. Yeah, please.
Are you, sorry.
Yeah.
You mentioned it doesn't relate to the same, like, as cows on grassland. If you bring goats into the forest, it's kind of the same thing. Like,
yeah, it's going to affect what species are there. So there's going to be a question of, is it sustainable? Yeah.
I guess I meant, that's very true, but was it the government money aspect?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of is doing the same thing. You're subsidizing the feed that you would have to feed those goats.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's the question is like, okay, I'm grazing them there. Do I pay a grazing fee for the forest? Or now does the Forest Service or whoever I'm working through to get the grazing license in the forest, now what do they charge me for that grazing fee? Or is it free because we've established that it's actually so much more beneficial than grazing in the grassland? Because the only way to really get the shift to happen with, with the industry is to have an economic incentive.
I think in the Bay Area they actually get paid to bring them in.
See, there you go. That's huge. That's a huge economic incentive. Is actually you now get an additional, you get some money, you get a place to graze your animals, and yeah. And then there's an ecological benefit. And that's what ecological economics is really all about, is trying to commodify the natural services that the ecosystem provides. Because removing some of that understory duff and those understory plants in a community that's already been disrupted by human activity is beneficial. But the forest can't write you a check. So the hope is that there's some entity that will write a check to these folks, which is always easier than telling people, don't do this because it's bad. It's always easier to be like, I'll give you $100 if you do this other option. It's more effective. It's more effective with me. I'll tell you that much, Awesome. Okay, cool. So we talked about grasslands. We talked about forests as two major ecosystem or habitat types that are under threat. That was sort of my mission there. I like to focus on just a couple. We talked about the boreal forests. I focused on that. And we talked about the grasslands. Those are our main focuses there. Now we can talk about parks and preserves. All right. Basically different degrees of protection for habitats. All right, cool. So here's some different categories of protected areas with ideas of how much protection they actually receive. Okay, so an ecological reserve in a wilderness area, a national park, natural monuments and archaeological sites, habitat and wildlife management areas, cultural or scenic landscapes, recreation areas. This managed resource area, this is actually going up in the degree of sort of going down in the degree of management, going up in the degree of management, with 6 having the lowest management as far as, sorry, let me just dial in here. I think that I wrote a dang bullet point here wrong at the top. So they vary in levels of protection received. That's accurate. But this little or none thing, this is relating to how much human impact is allowed. All right? So an ecological reserve in a wilderness area, you can't really take a lot out of it, right? A national park, you can't really take a lot out of it. A managed resource area on number 6 here, this is, you are allowing people to take from it regularly. You're just managing how they do it. So I'm going to need to revise this slide a little bit to make the point that I'm trying to illustrate clear enough. But that's perfect because we're at the end of our lecture. So I'll just revise this slide, come back on Wednesday, and we'll just all pretend this never happened. It'll be a great place to start. Cool. And then we'll talk about, designing these different reserves and what works the best. The small, many small, or a few large. Oh, cool. Yeah, we'll talk about this scuttling ships to make reefs. Super cool stuff. Anyway, thank you all for continuing to be a part of ESM 105. Don't forget about that annotated bibliography. Hopefully, with any luck, Canvas will be back up and running soon. Currently, it's still down. Have a great day. Probably. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.